Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling, it is the refusal to let feeling become a signal to the outside world. And most people misunderstand this because they've been trained to believe that power comes from expression, reaction, and visibility, when in reality, power has always belonged to the person who can feel everything internally while revealing nothing externally. Because the moment you show emotion, you give information, and the moment you give information, you surrender leverage. And this is the first hidden rule of every room you will ever enter, whether it is a workplace, a family gathering, a negotiation, a conflict, or even a casual social setting. The calmest person is not calm because they are passive or detached from reality. They're calm because they are in control of their internal economy. They have learned to regulate their nervous system so completely that chaos does not force a reaction out of them. And this ability begins with understanding how most humans are unconsciously governed by emotional reflexes they never chose. Reflexes installed early through conditioning, approval seeking, fear of rejection, and the deep biological urge to belong, which means that when tension appears, most people leak themselves instantly through their face, their tone, their posture, their breathing, and their words. They rush to explain, to defend, to justify, to joke, to dominate, or to escape, all of which communicate weakness in different costumes, while the emotionally neutral individual does none of this, not because they are suppressing emotion, but because they have trained themselves to process emotion internally before it ever reaches their behavior. And this training starts with a brutal realization that most emotional reactions are not responses to reality, they are responses to interpretation, and interpretation is optional, which means the first discipline of emotional neutrality is learning to pause between stimulus and response, a pause that most people never develop because they are addicted to immediacy, addicted to reacting in real time, addicted to being seen, heard, validated, and emotionally mirrored. And this addiction is why they lose control of rooms without ever understanding how it happened, because control is never seized aggressively, it is granted unconsciously by others when they sense stability, and stability is detected through consistency of behavior under pressure. When someone raises their voice and yours remains level, when someone tries to provoke and you remain unmoved, when uncertainty spreads and you remain composed, the room begins to orient itself around you without permission, without announcement, because humans are biologically wired to follow the nervous system that appears most regulated, the one that signals safety and authority at the same time. And emotional neutrality is the visible evidence of that regulation. But to achieve it, you must first confront the fact that most of your emotions are not yours. They are borrowed reactions inherited from family patterns, social scripts, cultural expectations, and unresolved insecurities, which means neutrality requires subtraction before it requires addition. You must strip away the habit of reacting to every tone change, every facial expression, every perceived slight, because most people are not responding to what is happening, they are responding to what they think it means about them. And this self-referential loop is what creates emotional volatility, the sense that everything is personal, everything is urgent, everything demands immediate engagement. And the emotionally neutral individual has exited this loop entirely. They have trained themselves to observe their emotions the same way they observe weather, without judgment, without dramatization, without identity attachment. Anger arises, acknowledged, contained, processed internally. Fear appears, recognized, contextualized, neutralized. Excitement comes, noted, stabilized. And because they do not become their emotions, they are not driven by them, which means their behavior remains predictable in the best possible way. And predictability under pressure is perceived as authority, because unpredictability signals instability, and instability makes others anxious, while neutrality calms the collective nervous system of the room. Even if people cannot articulate why, they simply feel it. And this is why emotionally neutral individuals are often described as intimidating, not because they are aggressive, but because they are unreadable. And unreadability creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces others to self-regulate in their presence. They speak more carefully, they behave more deliberately, they second-guess themselves, while the neutral one does nothing, says little, and yet commands space effortlessly. But this level of neutrality does not come from pretending not to care. That is emotional repression, and repression leaks eventually through passive aggression, sarcasm, burnout, or sudden emotional collapse. True neutrality comes from internal mastery, from developing the capacity to feel deeply without acting impulsively. And this capacity is built through deliberate exposure to discomfort, through placing yourself in situations where your triggers are activated and choosing stillness instead of reaction, again and again, until stillness becomes default, until your nervous system learns that it does not need to respond to every stimulus to survive. And this training is invisible, boring, and lonely, which is why few people ever complete it. They would rather perform emotion than discipline it, because performance brings immediate feedback, likes, agreement, sympathy, while discipline brings nothing visible at first, only silence, only restraint, only the quiet satisfaction of self-control. But over time, this restraint accumulates into presence, and presence is what people actually respect. Not loudness, not dominance displays, not emotional theatrics, but the sense that someone is internally solid, unmovable, centered. And when you become emotionally neutral, you stop being predictable in the way others expect. You stop being manipulable through praise or insult. You stop being pulled into unnecessary conflict. And this withdrawal from emotional chaos creates a vacuum, and nature hates vacuums, so others fill it with attention, deference, and projection. They assume depth where you show restraint, strength where you show calm, authority where you show control. And none of this is forced, none of it is claimed. It emerges naturally, because emotional neutrality is not something you announce, it is something others detect. And once detected, the dynamics of the room begin to shift subtly but permanently. Conversations slow down when you speak. Arguments soften when you enter. Energy levels recalibrate around you. And this is the foundation of silent authority. Not charisma, not persuasion, not dominance, but the ability to remain internally stable regardless of external volatility. And this stability begins with the decision to stop reacting automatically, to stop leaking emotion, to stop needing to be understood immediately, and to accept that neutrality will often be misunderstood as coldness, arrogance, or detachment by those who live emotionally exposed lives. But those interpretations are irrelevant, because neutrality is not a social strategy, it is a self-mastery practice, and self-mastery always precedes influence, always precedes control, always precedes authority. And in the next phase, once emotional neutrality is established, something more advanced becomes possible, something most people never experience, the ability to master tension itself, not avoid it, not dissolve it, but hold it, shape it, and use it as leverage, which is where true control of a room begins.
Once emotional neutrality is established, the next layer of control emerges not from removing tension, but from learning how to hold it without discomfort. Because tension is not the enemy people believe it to be. Tension is information. Tension is energy. Tension is the invisible current that decides who leads and who reacts. And most people rush to dissolve tension the moment it appears, because tension exposes their lack of internal stability. It forces their nervous system into action, into fidgeting, talking, explaining, laughing, overperforming, or retreating, all of which are subconscious attempts to regain comfort. But comfort-seeking is precisely what forfeits control, because the person who cannot sit inside tension will always be governed by the person who can. And this is where mastery begins, not through dominance or confrontation, but through the capacity to remain still while tension peaks. Because tension only feels unbearable when you are unfamiliar with it, when your nervous system interprets it as danger rather than intensity. And intensity is not harmful. It is simply heightened awareness, heightened stakes, heightened presence. And the calm individual understands this intuitively. They do not seek to smooth interactions prematurely. They do not rush to fill silence. They do not neutralize discomfort for the sake of social harmony, because they know that whoever breaks tension first reveals their need, and need is leverage surrendered. So instead, they let moments stretch, pauses deepen, eye contact linger, unanswered questions hang, and unresolved energy remain in the air, not out of cruelty, but out of control, because tension is what forces others to reveal themselves. Under tension, people talk more than they should, explain more than necessary, justify their positions, disclose insecurities, negotiate against themselves, while the one who holds tension remains opaque, gathering information without offering any. And this imbalance quietly shifts power dynamics, because rooms do not respond to words as much as they respond to emotional pressure, and pressure is shaped by whoever is least affected by it, which is why in negotiations, interrogations, leadership settings, and even everyday social dynamics, the individual who speaks less often directs the outcome because they allow tension to do the work for them. But this ability does not come naturally, it must be trained, because the instinct to relieve tension is deeply biological, rooted in tribal survival, where social friction meant exclusion. So your body will urge you to smooth things over, to seek agreement, to restore emotional equilibrium as fast as possible. And tension mastery requires overriding this instinct through repeated exposure, through intentionally allowing awkwardness, silence, disagreement, and unresolved moments to exist without intervention, until your nervous system learns that nothing breaks when tension is left alone, that the world does not collapse because you did not respond immediately, that relationships do not dissolve because you did not explain yourself. And as this conditioning rewires, something subtle happens internally. Your perception of time changes under pressure. Moments slow down, reactions decelerate, awareness sharpens, and you begin to see how others are moved by the very discomfort you now inhabit calmly. And this is where authority begins to crystallize, because authority is not loudness, it is gravity. It pulls attention without effort, and tension is the gravitational field of human interaction. Whoever controls it controls the room, not by speaking over others, but by letting silence speak louder than words. And this is why leaders who command respect often appear almost minimalist in their behavior. They do not rush, they do not over-communicate, they do not chase consensus. They allow tension to exist until clarity emerges naturally. And clarity always emerges from tension when it is not prematurely resolved, because tension forces prioritization. It reveals what actually matters, and most people cannot withstand this process, so they short-circuit it with noise, humor, distraction, or emotional displays, while the calm individual remains present, anchored, observant, and this presence changes how others behave around them. Conversations slow, voices lower, movements become more deliberate, because humans subconsciously mirror the most regulated nervous system in the room, and tension mastery signals regulation at the highest level. It says without words that you are not threatened by uncertainty, not rushed by discomfort, not destabilized by pressure, and this signal is deeply disarming, especially to those who rely on emotional escalation to gain control, because escalation only works when others rise with it. When you do not rise, when you do not meet intensity with intensity, escalation collapses under its own weight, leaving the escalator exposed, often embarrassed, often deflated. And this dynamic repeats itself across contexts. Arguments lose momentum, manipulative tactics fail, power plays dissolve, because tension has nowhere to attach, and what replaces it is a quiet authority that does not need to assert itself. But this mastery requires restraint that most people avoid because it feels counterintuitive. It feels passive, when in fact it is active containment. It is the disciplined choice to do less in moments where instinct demands more. And this discipline is what separates emotional strength from emotional expression, because expression releases tension, while containment concentrates it, and concentrated tension amplifies presence. And presence is the currency of control. And over time, as you practice holding tension without reacting, without filling, without escaping, you begin to notice a shift not only in others, but in yourself. Your internal dialogue quiets, your need to be right diminishes, your urge to be seen softens, and what remains is clarity, because clarity is what exists on the other side of unnecessary reaction. And this clarity allows you to respond instead of react, to choose words deliberately instead of impulsively, to enter rooms already composed instead of adjusting on the fly. And when your responses are rare but precise, when your words arrive slowly but land heavily, people listen differently, because scarcity creates value, and tension mastery creates scarcity of reaction, and this scarcity signals importance, which is why the calmest person often becomes the reference point in tense situations. Others look to them unconsciously, waiting for cues, mirroring their stillness, adjusting their behavior. And this is not something you can fake. It is felt at a visceral level, because tension mastery is embodied, not intellectual. It lives in posture, breathing, pacing, eye contact, and timing. And as this embodiment deepens, you no longer fear tense environments. You welcome them quietly, because tension becomes your medium, your element, the space where you are most alive and most in control. And once you can hold tension without needing to resolve it, once you can let pressure build without collapsing or exploding, something final begins to form around you, something people struggle to name but instantly recognize, an aura of authority, not granted by title or dominance, but earned through restraint. And that is where the room truly begins to orient itself around you, which leads into the final layer of control, the authority aura that emerges when calmness, neutrality, and tension mastery converge into presence that speaks without words.
Visibility, a willingness to work through phases where nothing can be shown, nothing can be explained, nothing can be celebrated, only endured. And public effort disrupts this process by encouraging premature exposure, premature narration, premature identity formation, because once someone publicly identifies with a goal, a routine, or a path, they feel pressure to maintain that identity even if it is not working, because abandoning it publicly feels like failure, while continuing privately would require humility and silence. And so many people double down on ineffective methods simply because they have already announced them, because they have already been seen pursuing them. And the audience becomes an invisible constraint, shaping decisions not based on effectiveness, but on consistency of image. And this is where public effort becomes actively harmful, because it locks people into suboptimal behaviors to preserve perception. And over time, the gap between appearance and reality widens, creating internal tension, because the person senses they are not progressing as expected, yet they are invested in maintaining the story of progress. And this tension often manifests as anxiety, irritability, burnout, because the mind is trying to reconcile two conflicting realities, the image of discipline and the absence of results. And instead of resolving this conflict by withdrawing from performance and recommitting to private work, most people attempt to manage it by increasing output, increasing visibility, increasing explanation, hoping that more noise will compensate for the lack of depth. But noise never builds structure, it only masks its absence temporarily. And eventually, the mask fails, because results are unforgiving. They arrive only when the underlying work has been done, regardless of how impressive the effort looked along the way. And when results do not arrive, the illusion of public effort collapses, leaving behind exhaustion and confusion, because the person did everything they were supposed to do according to the visible rules of productivity, yet nothing materialized. And this moment is often interpreted as bad luck, lack of talent, or external obstacles, when in reality it is the delayed consequence of substituting visibility for substance. And the uncomfortable truth is that real work is often indistinguishable from inactivity from the outside, because it involves long periods of repetition, refinement, failure, and adjustment that produce no immediate signal. And public effort teaches people to fear those phases, to fill them with updates, explanations, and performative motion, rather than respecting them as necessary phases of growth. And this fear of appearing inactive is one of the strongest barriers to mastery, because it pushes people to act prematurely, to switch paths too early, to abandon processes that require time, simply to maintain the appearance of progress. And this is why public effort creates shallow trajectories, rapid starts followed by stagnation, enthusiasm followed by exhaustion, because it rewards movement without direction and punishes stillness even even when stillness is required. And the most dangerous aspect of this lie is that it feels virtuous, because effort is being exerted, time is being spent, energy is being invested, yet the investment is misallocated, poured into signaling rather than compounding, into expression rather than construction. And until a person recognizes that public effort is not neutral but actively shapes behavior, they will continue mistaking activity for advancement. And this recognition is difficult because it requires withdrawing from applause, resisting explanation, tolerating invisibility, and accepting that for a long time there will be nothing to show, nothing to share, nothing to validate the work except the work itself. And here the path splits, because one direction leads back to performance, comfort, and familiar feedback, while the other leads into quiet, unacknowledged labor that feels unrewarded but builds something that cannot be taken away. And most people choose the former not because they are weak, but because the latter offers no immediate emotional compensation, no reassurance, no proof, only the slow accumulation of capacity. And yet it is only through this accumulation that inevitable results are born, because results do not respond to effort that is seen, they respond to effort that is sustained, and sustained effort almost always happens away from the audience, away from the noise, away from the stage, in places where no one is counting, clapping, or caring. And until a person accepts that public effort is a lie, comforting, socially rewarded, but structurally empty, they will continue working hard without becoming formidable, visible without being effective, and busy without being dangerous.
There's a moment that almost no one prepares for, a moment that arrives quietly after the excitement fades and the audience thins, when the noise that once surrounded effort dissolves, and what remains is a long stretch of unobserved time, repetitive tasks, uncertain progress, and no immediate feedback. And this is the threshold of the unseen grind, the place where discipline either becomes real or quietly dies. Because the unseen grind does not reward enthusiasm, it does not respond to intention, it does not care how strong the beginning felt, it only responds to consistency under conditions that feel emotionally unrewarding. And most people misinterpret the discomfort of this phase as a sign that something is wrong, that motivation is missing, that the path is flawed, when in reality the discomfort is simply the absence of witnesses, the removal of external reinforcement, and the exposure of how dependent effort had become on being observed. And this is why the unseen grind feels heavier than it should, not because the work is objectively harder, but because the mind is no longer being compensated with validation, no longer distracted by feedback, no longer reassured by reaction. And without those signals, the nervous system panics slightly, searching for confirmation that the effort matters, that it is leading somewhere, that it is not being wasted. And when that confirmation does not arrive, doubt fills the space, not the dramatic kind, but a low-level erosion that asks quietly, day after day, why continue? And this is where most people turn back, because the unseen grind offers nothing to hold on to except process. And process feels empty to a mind trained on outcomes and applause. Yet this emptiness is precisely what makes the unseen grind transformative, because it forces effort to detach from emotion, from identity signaling, from performance, and reattach to structure, repetition, and internal standards. And this transition is not comfortable because it requires the ego to shrink. It requires the self to operate without mirrors. It requires the person to measure progress in private, often imperfect ways, and to trust that compounding is happening even when it cannot be felt. And this trust is not faith, it is a skill developed through repetition, through showing up on days that feel indistinguishable from failure, through completing tasks that produce no visible reward, through continuing when the mind insists that nothing is changing,
because the unseen grind is where time finally begins to work in your favor. Not because it becomes exciting, but because it becomes boring enough to sustain. And boredom is the true gatekeeper of mastery, not difficulty, because difficulty can be stimulating, dramatic, even motivating, while boredom is flat, repetitive, emotionally neutral, and demands a different kind of strength, the strength to persist without stimulation, to repeat without novelty, to refine without recognition. And when someone enters the unseen grind fully, something subtle begins to happen. Their relationship with effort changes, because effort is no longer something they perform, it becomes something they execute. No longer something they talk about, but something they schedule. No longer something that defines their identity outwardly, but something that structures their days inwardly. And this shift reduces friction, because effort is no longer negotiated emotionally each day, it is simply enacted. And this is where discipline begins to harden, because discipline thrives on predictability, on systems, on rituals that operate regardless of mood. And the unseen grind strips away the emotional drama that often surrounds self-improvement, leaving behind a simpler, harsher reality. Do the work or don't, without justification, without explanation, without an audience to impress. And many people discover here that they have been relying on emotion to fuel consistency, using motivation as a trigger to act. And when that emotion disappears, they feel powerless. But those who stay learn a different mechanism. They learn to attach action to time, to environment, to rules rather than feelings. And this mechanical approach feels cold at first, almost inhuman, because it removes the narrative of passion and replaces it with obligation. But obligation is far more reliable than inspiration, because it does not fluctuate with confidence or attention. And in the unseen grind, obligation becomes a stabilizing force, a quiet agreement with the self that does not require witnesses to enforce it. And over time, this agreement builds a form of self-trust that cannot be achieved through public effort, because it is forged in conditions where quitting would go unnoticed, where shortcuts would remain hidden, where only personal integrity determines whether the work gets done. And integrity exercised privately has a different weight than integrity displayed publicly, because there is no social cost to failure, only an internal one. And learning to care about that internal cost more than external perception is one of the most difficult psychological shifts a person can make, because it requires valuing future capability over present comfort, delayed outcome over immediate reassurance. And this valuation is not natural, it is trained, repetition by repetition, decision by decision, in moments that feel small and insignificant. Yet these moments accumulate, and slowly the unseen grind begins to change how effort feels, not by making it exciting, but by making it familiar. And familiarity reduces resistance, because the mind no longer expects a reward at the end of each session. It begins to accept effort as a baseline state rather than an exceptional event. And this acceptance is dangerous in the best way, because it removes the drama that often sabotages long-term progress, the cycles of hype and disappointment, the emotional highs and crashes, replacing them with a steady, almost indifferent continuation. And in this state, progress becomes quieter but more consistent, slower but more reliable, because it is no longer competing with the need to be seen. And this is why people who master the unseen grind often appear calm, even detached, because their effort is not fueled by urgency or fear of judgment, but by routine. And routine is emotionally neutral, which allows energy to be conserved and directed toward refinement rather than self-regulation. And refinement is where real improvement occurs, not in bursts of effort, but in small adjustments made repeatedly over time, adjustments that are too subtle to showcase, too boring to explain, but decisive in their cumulative effect. And the unseen grind provides the space for these adjustments to occur, because there is no pressure to perform, no need to exaggerate progress, no temptation to rush milestones for the sake of perception, and this freedom allows mistakes to be corrected quietly, weaknesses to be addressed honestly, and methods to be refined without embarrassment, because no one is watching. And this privacy accelerates learning because it removes the ego's need to defend an image and instead allows it to focus or effectiveness. And as this focus deepens, the person begins to experience a different kind of satisfaction, not the sharp pleasure of praise, but the dull confidence of knowing something is being built correctly, even if it is not yet visible. And this confidence is subtle, often unnoticed at first, but it stabilizes behavior because it is rooted in evidence accumulated through action rather than approval granted by others. And eventually, this internal evidence becomes enough to continue without reassurance, enough to tolerate long periods of ambiguity, enough to work without witnesses indefinitely. And this is the point where discipline becomes self-sustaining, not because it feels good, but because it feels necessary, because the system has been built, the habits installed, the rules internalized, and breaking them would feel more disruptive than continuing. And this reversal is the true reward of the unseen grind, not immediate results, but a restructuring of how effort operates, shifting from emotional to procedural, from expressive to functional, from visible to effective. And once this restructuring is complete, the person no longer fears invisibility, because invisibility is no longer associated with stagnation, but with construction. And silence is no longer interpreted as absence of progress, but as a sign that the work has moved beneath the surface, where it compounds without interference. And this is why people who survive the unseen grind often become difficult to read from the outside, because their effort is no longer broadcast, their progress no longer narrated, their identity no longer tied to performance. And when results eventually appear, they seem sudden, even surprising, to those who were not there during the quiet years. But for the one who endured the unseen grind, the results feel inevitable, not because they were guaranteed, but because the work never stopped when no one was watching.